Welcome to the Home Recording Show. This is episode 309. Today we're going to talk about 32-bit recording. I'm John Tidey from ReaperBlog.net.
And I'm Ryan Canestro in my house.
So you brought us this topic today, and it's actually something that came up over on Twitter for me earlier this week. So it's just interesting how we come into the same topic.
It's in the air
at different times. Yeah.
There was an article recently in the local 695, my union's magazine. They put out a monthly thing, and there's always little tech articles in the back. And this one was talking about the future of 32-bit float point in recording and how it's going to revolutionize recording going forward. So I read the article and I saw all of the normal, has a ton of range, way more than 16-bit or 24-bit. It's a floating integer, so it's calibrated in a different way. So all of the things, and we'll get into some of the tech aspects of it for sure. But I was still trying to figure out how does that apply to recording audio? And I can't find a way where that makes sense in the real world for me. So that's kind of what I wanted to get into and see if we can figure out what does it have to do with tracking?
This is something new. I'll just generalize and say that in most situations, it's not useful. There's some situations where it is useful, but for the most part, if you can set your gain correctly, you don't need it. Let's first talk about 16-bit files, 16-bit WAV files.
Mm-hmm.
So 16-bit WAV files stores as uncompressed audio samples where each number is a binary bit. They call that fixed point. I'm skimming an article as I'm explaining this.
We'll break it down too. So just we'll hit the bullet points on the technical, then we'll explain what that is.
Right. So it's a 16-bit number in binary form represents integers from 0 to 65,535.
So that's how many values there are to be able to store the dynamic range from a whisper to a scream, from the probably at the bottom isn't even audible to the human ear, but that's how the lowest to the highest sound pressure could be stored. There's that many values from 0 to 65,000 you said?
Yeah, so that comes out to minus 96.3 decibels, or that's the dynamic range, 96 decibels. Moving up to 24-bit, 8 more bits, that gives more resolution for those discrete levels. And so that gets us down to 144.5 decibels of dynamic range.
Just 50% more dynamic range, which is significant and super useful.
50% more data being written and read as well.
So more values from the lowest to the highest possible sound.
Right. But let's say we've got a sound that is at minus 4 dB. Minus 4 dB in a 24-bit file versus a 16-bit file versus a 32-bit file, it's the same. It sounds the same. So it's really only important when you are trying to capture things with high dynamic range, loud sounds and quiet sounds simultaneously.
So a use case for this would be like, I was on set. We were recording last night. We were doing it was a campsite. Something spooky happens outside. They're inside of a tent whispering very quietly, and then tent opens and people are now screaming. So to capture from that very quiet sound to that very loud sound, what I did was to gain down as quickly as I could, going from one section to the next, knowing what's going to happen. Let's say we're in a reality situation where we don't know what's going to happen as a mixer, and they go from whispering to screaming, and you don't know what's coming.
If you're recording in an integer format, you have clipping potentially in those files, unless you're leaving yourself a lot of headroom, which could potentially put you into the noise floor in the quieter sections. You had to change the gain rapidly between things. Certain recorders, if it's a digitally controlled gain knob, you might get zipper noise when you're moving that while there's sound happening. So you ideally wouldn't want to do that. Or even like preamps in general can have scratchy pots. So that will get into the sound and have a worse issue than just being too quiet. Let's talk about how 32-bit is stored. So rather than an integer format, it's a decimal and exponent format.
Fancy math.
Math optimized for the computers to handle it, rather than, just integers that we can do.
Yeah, because I'm always taking a look at my files and really doing the integer math by hand
Right.
per
But
sample.
I guess there are some situations, maybe in coding, it's easier
Yeah.
to code with integers than
It's human readable. Let's just say that.
it's or closer to.
Yeah.
But this is, rather than just having a separate bit for each sample value, it's now a plus or minus sign, an exponent. That's the first, I think, 8 digits, and then the last 23 or so bits are what's called the mantissa. So it's just confusing.
So,
You can't.
well,
you
what
can't
what that
do
all
this.
does is gives you a dynamic range that's what, like 100 times more. What's the actual number?
It's
Significant.
over 1,500 decibels.
Yeah. So it's
It's
massive.
700. So you've got your normal dynamic range of 24-bit plus or minus 770 dB.
Yeah. So, but the file size is only 50% larger. So that's what all the fancy math gets you. But you have
Right.
a dynamic range. So what's the dynamic range of 16-bit? It was 96.
Yeah, it was 96 dB.
And then the dynamic range of 32-bit float point was what, 1500?
Yeah.
And the loudest sound on Earth is somewhere north of 200 dB.
Something like that. Yeah.
Like a volcanic eruption. So you have more dynamic range than anything that could possibly happen on Earth.
Right. And there's no way to play that back with full dynamic range either.
No.
But we have a way of storing it at least now.
So here's where the problem comes in for me. When you're recording something, you have a microphone, you have a preamp, you have the electronics, you have everything, the front end to gather that information. How could you possibly record anything? You have to record it without peaking, blowing up the mic capsule, blowing up the electronics of the mic, blowing up the preamp. Those are all still a factor. So I don't understand, without using minimal gain to record something to capture that huge range, or not, obviously not using all of it, but using 200 dB of range, then you would have to gain up everything so much in post. That would be destructive gain on the quieter signals, would it not?
The weird thing about how it's recorded is not like a typical recording path is mic to your audio device with a potentiometer to control the level, going into an amplifier, and then into an A to D converter. With a 32-bit recorder, it's either 2 or 3 preamp stages right after the input. So it's split into 2 or 3, depending on the device. There's a low gain, a medium gain, and a high gain amplifier. So it just automatically amplifies it. The medium gain signal is measured, and they figure out, on basically a sample block basis, which of the other signals need to be blended in. And it's constantly swapping between a high gain signal and a low gain signal based on if it's distorted or if it's noisy.
So that would be the dedicated hardware to utilize that. So you're just taking 3 preamps, 3 sources. So, I mean, you could just take a mic, split it off, and then send it to 3 different preamps, but you're still at the mercy of the pressure levels that microphone can take.
Right. And then it's automatically, creating a single file set to whatever preamp level you determine, or whatever your preferred level is. You mentioned all the input side stuff. There's also the monitoring side stuff. How do you monitor something that is going to be clipping? Even just playing it back without having to do post-production work to it is a tricky thing. I'm going to read something from Kai Paquin's website. He is a sound designer. He does a lot of work with ultrasonic recording, but he's also done some work with 32-bit recording. And he has a really good description or summary of how these devices work, and we'll have a link to this in the show notes. I'm going to read what he has here. In a 24-bit recorder, the pipeline works kind of like this. Microphone creates a very small electric signal that's fed into a recorder. The signal is adjusted by a potentiometer, your gain knob. The signal is conditioned by a preamp. The amplified signal is converted into a digital signal by an ADC, analog digital converter. A 32-bit recorder works like this, using the Mix Pre series as an example, which is a sound devices recorder.
That's what I'm recording on right now.
The microphone creates a small electrical signal fed into the recorder. that is amplified through 3 preamps. The amplified signals are converted to a digital signal. A data buffer breaks each of these 3 signals into millisecond byte-sized chunks. The lowest and medium gain settings are processed, and a processor calculates a vector of these 2 signals. In layman's terms, it's making a synthesized version of the waveform between those 2 signals. The same processes is repeated between the middle and high gain signals. The processor now looks at the 3 original amplified signals and the 2 synthesized signals and determines which of those signals are clean and which are distorted, and which has the least preamp noise. The processor takes the cleanest signal from one of the 3 amplifiers, digitally amplifies to match where your gain knob is set, then writes it to the disk. So yeah, it's constantly reading these actual preamp values plus the difference between the different preamp values with their synthesized version, and then writes whatever the best noise floor, best dynamic range, or headroom version is to the file. And that's stored as a 32-bit file, which means that when you bring it into a DAW, it may look extremely quiet, or it may look
extremely
clipped. Sound Devices has a really great article showing this. There's a sample files page where you can see how they work with it in Isotope RX. If you're used to a 24-bit file and you bring it in and it's clipped, there's nothing you can do. You can turn it down, but it'll still sound distorted.
It's going to be clipped. You're just bringing down the clipped file.
These mic preamps, they work differently than the typical studio mic preamp because they're taking multiple signals, getting all these different gain ranges, and then the difference or whatever the optimized version comes out at the end. So unless you're recording into a 24-bit format, you can't really clip them. And you can apply like 1,000 dB of gain to bring up something that would normally be buried in the noise floor, which is really weird because it's recording into a lossless file that contains tons of data, more than our typical view of like -60 to 0 or even +12 or something.
Yeah, is there a noise floor in a 32-bit float point file? Like that's kind of weird if you think about it too, because you have to think about it totally differently. And where we think of as 0, where the digital clipping is, that's the center line of a 32-bit float point file.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. So what you can do, and this is true of computer recorded 32-bit files as well. So if you record from a digital source within Reaper, for example, you can normalize a file that was recorded above 0, normalize it and bring it back down to 0. And that will completely remove any audible distortion that was there. It just it uses those floating bits and shifts the center line. That works really well.
So essentially what this does is prevents the digital clipping within the file. So if you max out the file, you're fine. But you cannot max out any of the analog front end, which the Sound Devices system it's ingenious and interesting, but you have that entire hardware system working in concert with the file format to be able to still choose the cleanest signal possible. But
right.
if you blew up your microphone, or maybe you have a wireless setup, there's a preamp in there if you blow up that. So I could see maybe down the line the 32-bit float point happening in the wireless systems, and all of the systems all the way down the line. But you have to get it in clean. And it's interesting that there's more ingenious ways to get your source material clean. I mean, I have heard of people, especially with, it doesn't really work with wireless, but wired booms on set, and you run that into a mic split, and then you have it set at a high gain, like a normal gain, and a low gain. So that way you always have that second channel, and then you would manually do that. So it's kind of interesting that there is an automatic system that is doing this work.
Right. You do need to go into those files where you have those kind of clipped sections and apply some gain, like -20 or something on those clipped sections, and then resave that as a 24-bit file if you want. So you kind of need to go through and you do need to manually regain things to make them work.
Well, couldn't you just use this kind of system with the 3 preamps and it would choose the right one in a 24-bit file and move on with your life?
Um, yes and no. In a way, it kind of needs to work like compression to actually get it into a usable range. Because, most dialogue, it's pretty low level, and it can't be too low. So we're really only working within maybe 8 dB of dynamic range or 8 decibels of variation between things. Mm-hmm. But in terms of finished production work, but
yeah. But in practice,
with real life, it could be anywhere. It could, we could have people whispering and people screaming within a few minutes of each other in the recording, and you can't constantly adjust for that. Well, potentially you don't need to do that anymore. It does lead to more post-production work. You mentioned 32-bit lav mics. So there's a company, well, there's a few of them. There's the Zoom F2 field recorder, the F2 BT field recorder. These are pocket-size lav recorders. Those are two kind of low-priced ones that record internally at 32-bit float. They don't even have a mic gain control on it.
They just record.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
There's the Tentacle Track E. It's a field recorder lav that, again, there's no settings, there's no gain control. There's Zaxcom, I think, is one that is a transmitter and internal recorder, 32-bit recorder. That one has a very annoying conversion process to get the files off of the device.
Zaxcom does make the high-end stuff in my field.
But again, it's like, if you can set the levels right, you don't need any of this. But for those situations where you need to leave a mic somewhere and there's a potential of clipping, then this is a lifesaver. The plant mics on set, or sound effects recording where, let's say, you need the hiss of the firecracker plus the explosion of it, all of that within a single file with the same gain setting, and you can adjust that in post without any audible distortion.
Yeah,
is great.
I did a shoot on really a gun range where they were shooting guns and then they were talking in between. So
yeah,
I had to set up 2 mics, one with the gain at almost nothing. Every time the gun went off, the boom would explode, but then I could get it back in. So I had to keep mixing back and forth between the 2 sources, but that would be kind of amazing to be able to capture both on one. But then again, the actual microphone, the 416, was internally peaking with the gunshots.
Okay. Yeah. That's one thing that can't be removed. And a lot of mics, they have a pretty good high SPL level. If it's especially dynamic mics for that, they're less sensitive to that. Yeah. The 416, you'd probably need a pad on it.
But even then, you'd probably overload the internal electronics of the capsule.
It's possible. Yeah.
And that's what was happening. I ended up using an SM57 to get the gunshots because what else are you going to get that close up?
Right.
If you think of a snare shot with the mic that close, put your ear that close to a snare. I mean, that's pretty high sound pressure levels, and the 57s are made for it. They love it.
Yeah. A lot of those field recorders, when you're connecting to USB to use as a studio interface, actually don't record 32-bit. Some of them do, but you have to be very careful of. I think all the Zoom ones don't. They only capture internally at 32-bit, but if connected to a computer, they only do 24-bit. So if you set your DAW to 32-bit float recording, you forget about mic preamp settings at all, and then try to normalize it after, you're still going to have distorted recordings. You need something that actually outputs that I don't know if you would call it raw 32-bit data or whatever, but it needs something that its driver is actually 32-bit. So Steinberg makes some. I think the Sound Devices ones do, but I don't know 100% for sure which ones do.
I think it's all of the Mix Pre version 2. I have a version 1. I think it might record 32-bit, but it might not. I think only the version 2s might record 32-bit.
It's interesting stuff. It's great to see some innovation in preamps because, they've been kind of the same for a really long time. And everyone in general in the studio world just wants what Neve makes.
Yeah.
The same thing that Neve made in the 70s. So
Well,
Um,
when you're in the studio, you know about how loud a snare drum is going to be for that track. You know
yeah,
about how loud the singer is going to sing. You do, okay, let's run the track real quick. Let's get some settings. You have that opportunity. It's more of that real world. You don't know what's going to happen. You're out with a video team in the forest, and you think you're going to shoot some quiet nature scene, and a bear attacks or something. Who knows? You're
yeah,
not prepared for something. You still want to capture it, and to have garbled audio because you were just not prepared. It's unfortunate, but that happens a lot. So
yeah.
this might alleviate that, but it does have a complicated front end system that runs it. So that's the part that none of the articles I was reading kind of answered that analog question. How do you get it from the mic to the preamp to that file system?
Right.
The other thing I saw was when it comes to plugins and processing stuff that's already in the digital domain, and being
Yeah.
able to go back in virtual instruments, and to, if something was clipping, if it's a 32-bit float point, then you can just slide that down, and then you're no longer digitally clipping because it was something that was digitally
So
generated.
that stuff has been kind of the standard for probably 12, 15 years, maybe a bit more than that. 32-bit float or even 64-bit float, which is just adding another like
Trillion.
multiplier for yeah. So Justin Frankel is the creator of Reaper, and he has a website, askjf.com, where people just ask him questions about coding and things like that. And I searched it this morning and found some things about this. So someone asked, can you explain the advantage of 64-bit floating processing? I understand this leads to less calculation errors, but is there actually an audible difference? His reply, 32-bit floating point is plenty of precision for representing pretty much any signal, but anytime you do any non-trivial calculation with it, you end up with small rounding errors, which by themselves are almost always insignificant. But do enough of these calculations and they start accumulating. Does it always sound better? No. Can it be in some instances? Yes. So it's just higher precision. In a lot of places, 64-bit float is just called double precision. And yeah, it's to prevent rounding errors accumulating into something that actually matters. Yeah, so most plugins in a DAW are going to be running above 24-bit integer. Reaper has the option of doing 64-bit for all of the volume adjustment and all the plugins. You can import a 24-bit sound file. And as soon as you touch the level or panning or anything, it's now playing out at 64 bits. So all of that processing has just so much more headroom. You can't clip it. You can't distort it in any destructive way from there, which is fantastic. It really, you don't need to worry about those clip lights anymore.
Yeah, and it's something that we've never thought of, and it's happening in the background. So we're actually using it already without even knowing.
I mean, all this headroom is great, but at the end of the day, we're usually limiting it to -1, and and just we have maybe 6 dB of usable range.
Yeah, all this
So
range
it
in the
doesn't matter,
world,
but
and yeah, we're using like 6 dB of it.
yeah. So how can we wrap this up and have something that everyone can take away from this? Are you going to be using 32-bit float for your sound devices?
No.
All right.
Now, I'm very interested in where this technology is going to. Currently, for my work in field recording, it's going to continue to be 48K 24-bit. That's what Post is expecting. In scripted, I can determine what we're doing. I can, if something is really bad, like it's unexpected, I could say, hey, I need another take. I didn't get it. I never want to be that guy, but it happens every now and then. But it would be amazing to have a 32-bit system that was standard, that Post would be familiar with, that there would never be a situation where I didn't get something because it was too loud. But that would also have to go all the way down the line. That would have to be the microphone, the wireless, the receiver, the wireless receiver, the recorder, the preamps. I mean, it's the entire system. So in the real world, that's a lot of pieces. In post processing, in digital creation, totally makes sense. All the pieces are self-contained. But
Yeah.
the real world application is what really got me thinking about all of this and really got me interested in what can it actually do. And until we really had this discussion, I never really thought of it having a real world application, but I think it does. And I am excited for what's coming.
Yeah. I remember seeing digital microphones back in 2006 when I was in school.
And it seems
Sennheiser
silly,
came.
right?
Yeah. And it was like a true digital microphone, not like a USB microphone. But I don't know, if they must have 32-bit float, but you could do all sorts of changes to it. And that is not a system that has caught on universally. But
because it requires so much additional change. It's like
I think it does.
The converter right after the capsule, basically, right?
Right. And maybe even a gain. Yeah, like a gain stage right after the capsule
or multiple gain stages.
Yeah, multiple gain stages. Yeah, to be able to keep headroom. The limitation there is still going to be the extreme SPL hitting the capsule.
Yeah, once the capsule flattens out, there's nothing you can do.
There's probably some limitation of noise and things like that. But like the sound devices, the Zoom recorders, they still have their own preamp noise, but they're internally optimizing within every millisecond sample block to keep that low, which is really cool. But there is a potential where you need to gain something up, and you're not getting noise from the digital process. The noise floor of the analog to digital conversion isn't being brought up. It's the internal mic preamp noise.
But then there's also the ambient. So if you're doing ambient whisper to a scream, noise, you're going to hear so much ambient noise and then none when it's a scream, and then right back to whispering. It's like in the dead silent for that scream, for the whispers again.
Yeah, but that's why you have room tone.
Yes, or noise reduction in post.
But yeah, that's 100% true. Like the ambient noise is going to be probably louder than the noise floor of your microphone and your preamps. So yeah, it's great that at least one of these, it's going to be clean.
And that's where, like, reading all these articles, it's going to revolutionize everything we do. You still have the real world factors. And that's what all of these articles gloss over. How do we deal with some of like the room tone issue and it fluctuating? And I know, cool, we could do super fast gain adjustments, or we can record this huge range. You're still going to have those real world considerations. And that's the part where my mind goes to every time I read these. But I think we're going to continue to see ways to get around the real world things. And that's what's interesting to me.
Right on. So guys, if you enjoyed this episode or any of the episodes that we do, please consider being a supporter over on buymeacoffee.com. It's only $5 and it helps support what we do, helps pay me for doing all the editing.
Yeah, give John money.
Of these. Yeah, and if you do, that gets your name at the end of the show. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and see you guys in 2 weeks.
Yeah, thanks for checking us out. We'll see you next time.